Hi, my name is Patricia Lewis. I'm the Research Director for International Security at Chatham House. And I just want to say, as we're coming towards the last two sessions of the afternoon, what a delight it has been to be involved in the planning of this meeting with Wendy and the two Jeremys, as I like to call them, Jeremy to the power of two. So the last panel was fantastic. I think it leads directly into this next panel, which is the final panel before the closing keynote speech. And all roads in the day are leading to these next two discussions, it seems to me, on the social, legal, ethical, and then the global issues of the Internet of Things. We're going to start with our first speaker, who is Maria Farrell. Maria is an Irish writer and consultant based in London. She's been senior consultant at Internet Communications, deputy head of corporate affairs and policy officer at ICANN. She's been based in Brussels, Los Angeles, Washington D.C. She's led communication and government advisory project at InfoDev, the World Bank IFC program on technology and development. And she was internet policy analyst at the International Chamber of Commerce in Paris, the UK's Confederation of British Industry, and the Law Society of England and Wales. She's a graduate college of UCD and DIT and LSE. That's a good lot of acronyms, Maria. Welcome, and we're looking forward to what you have to say.
Oh, brilliant, super. Hi, I'm Maria Farrell. I am going to talk today about something that is so ineffable, I'm finding it a little hard to grasp, let alone articulate, so I hope you're going to bear with me. What I want to talk about, and I'm moving away from the microphone, excuse me, but is this nice little glowy bit in here. The essence of creativity, the bit that makes us human, the bit that makes it all worthwhile. What is that going to mean to us? Our ability to think big, radical, new thoughts in a world of ambient surveillance. What's going to change? Well, I've worked in internet policy for about 20 years, and that's sort of one side of my brain. And the other side of my brain is that I write fiction, and I am laboriously, painfully, tortuously coming to the end of my first novel, which is going to be about British army wives and the quantum multiverse. You're all going to want to buy it. And this year, in 2017, those two strains came together in my life because I was commissioned by the Internet Society, which is a big international non-profit working in this area, to write about 24 short stories, science fiction short stories, about what the Internet was going to be like in 25 years' time. Now, they hired me because they had this fantastic flagship report full of lots of facts and interviews and very serious and important-looking prose. And they wanted some fiction to go along with it. Now, why? Well, because stories don't stop at just telling us a plot, telling us what happened and what happened next. They engage not just our intellect, but also our emotions and our imaginations. The way they do that is, in a way, stories are a bit like icebergs. You see the bit that's going along the top, which is the plot, the dialogue, the tone, all of that craft stuff. But really, underneath the waterline, you actually have something which is like the subconscious of the story. And that's the stuff that's really hard to write. But it's the stuff that makes stories sticky and makes them still be in our mind, sort of mulling them over days, weeks, months, years after we've read them. Internet Society wanted stories because they wanted people to be really thinking with their hearts and souls almost about this stuff because it's that important to them. And so how do you do this as a writer? Well, how do you create a subconscious for a story? What you do is you sort of unravel a little tiny golden thread to your own subconscious and you try and pull on it, tug gently on it, and see what comes out. You also use craft. You write dialogue that isn't quite on the nose, that doesn't quite communicate directly how people feel. You come up with images that sort of suggest things but don't say them outright. You come up with metaphors or symbolic acts that don't quite exhaust all of the emotions and the trajectories of the people that go into them and come out of them. It's tricky work, and it requires focus, determination, craft, and speaking for the people who do this well, not speaking for myself, but a certain amount of courage, a bravery, a sense of being able to exist in a zone or in a mode where you are free, where you are both private and yet also communicating to the collective subconsciouses of all of the people who you hope will read your story. And I think that's very similar in a way to how we develop radical new political ideas. We have to be brave, we have to be courageous, we have to do things and think things in a way that other people haven't. We have to think nasty thoughts, we have to think unpleasant thoughts, to make stories about real humans or to make theories about how life might actually be. Here we are in the Royal Society, where probably many of you are more familiar than I am with, for example, Thomas Kuhn's theory of scientific revolutions, right? The idea that scientific paradigms are pushed to the maximum, and when they are finished, when they stop explaining the world, we have to throw them away entirely. So those are new paradigms, new ways of thinking, something that is truly disruptive, not just this sort of soft soap, incremental process improvement that we talk about, that we really are talking about when we talk about disruption and innovation. I'm talking about creativity that is radical and that is sometimes unpleasant. Brilliant. So, what does that have to do with the Internet of Things, apart from science fiction occasionally providing us with really gnarly use cases for all this technology? Well, here's my pitch to you. And it's this. It's by putting sensors in public and private spaces, by extracting data from every choice we make, every movement we make, every banal, silly little thing we do, from going shopping to running the bath. We're changing something about our ability to exist in that zone of autonomy, privacy, freedom, and strength. In fact, we are accepting, in a way, that as we move through what we used to distinguish between private and public space, it's now all effectively public space. We're accepting that our choices and our movements are datafied, are commodified, are subject to our data being taken away by others, and being made into money, being made into power in ways and by organizations with whom we often have no direct relationship and over whom we have very, very little claims. And crucially, about whom we know almost nothing. The Internet of Things, in a way, prevents us from ever being alone and unobserved again. And those qualities are essential to true radical creativity. Crucially, the Internet of Things prevents us from ever feeling alone and unobserved again. Philosophers and writers love to walk and to think. Here's just a couple that pop into the front of my head. Immanuel Kant, famously, Friedrichsburg, you could set your watch by him. He walked out every day at exactly the same time. He actually, I'd like to say he nodded to people and they nodded back. He never said anything to anyone at all, particularly unsociable man. Walter Benjamin and Baudelaire, the famous flaneurs of Berlin and of Paris, people who walked out amongst the city, seeing and being seen, interacting in a sort of a reciprocal relationship with all of the people around them. Virginia Woolf, a famous walker around London and on the Sussex Downs. There's something different about the quality of how we walk and interact and with people who can see us that we don't have when we're going around walking in a city like this. We're between, in the UK, 4 and 5 million CCTV cameras. We're the most surveilled society in the world. Bins during the Olympics, picking up people's media access control, unique identifier numbers, a bit of a scandal then. Actually now quite normalized. TfL is apparently going to all do this whether we agree to it or not. Here's a piece of a screen grab from something that went up on YouTube about 10 days ago. It's some technology developed by a company called SmartSense in China to, in real time, turn video into structured data. Here we are capturing unique identifiers, license plates, using gait recognition, facial recognition, doing crowd mood analysis, basically in real time so that we can manage and control populations at large. There's one thing that brings all of these technologies together, and that's asymmetry. That is imbalance or inequality. Those who are observed have very, very little power in relation to those who are doing the observing. Max Weber, the 19th century German sociologist, was the first person to notice that there are very, very similar aims and goals of capitalism and of bureaucracy, which is basically to make legible all of human activity, to make it legible so that it's more manageable. Michel Foucault, and it noticed that the experience of being observed, the experience of being surveilled, causes people to not simply change their outward behaviour, but also to change that presumably inviolable core of who they are. And it's no mistake that a gay man living at a very homophobic historic moment was the first person to notice how people's expectations of how you behave can change how you feel inside, can corrupt that inviolable core. So, if knowledge is power, in which direction is the power flowing? Well, obviously it's flowing away from us and out of us. Of course, other things are going on too. There's what we can call the cognitive imperialism of social media, the idea that our relations with other humans should be manipulated and monetized to sell us ads, to produce more data, to then be sold ads to in this constant cycle of attention seeking. It's not great for creativity, obviously, especially if you're a writer and you spend too much time on Twitter. However, this is what the IoT does. It makes surveillance seem normal. It makes anyone who objects to it or resists it in any way seem sort of a difficult person, or even kind of a slightly silly. There's something slightly silly and precious about saying, this makes me feel different when I move through the world, to know that I'm being watched by people that I cannot watch in return. But the truth, I believe, is that being permanently watched in our homes as we move through the world is affecting our ability to do deep, sustained, creative, radical work. Why? Because somebody is always looking over our shoulder. We're always thinking, how do I present myself? How does this look to other people? Writers have always talked about this sort of thing. Virginia Woolf repeatedly talked about how essential it was to her to be private, alone, and submerged. She developed an entirely different way of writing novels, partly through her correspondence and partly through her own diaries. The moment where I realized that I had no privacy of correspondence and no privacy of any of the notes that I take on my computer was early in the spring of 2003. So it's been a pretty rough innings since then. Zadie Smith, another national treasure, talks about the need to not be public and to be performing yourself all of the time as being essential to what she does. She says she knows it's important to be appropriate in public life, social life, and political life, but in your soul, no, you can't always be appropriate and be right. So I should put on my glasses because I'm not sure what time it is. Got it. So here's the pitch. Here's my pitch to you. It's hard to get a grasp on this. It's hard to figure out exactly what it means when, is it important? Are writers and creatives and all of those sorts of people just the canaries in the coal mine? Or is this something we're going to adapt to like we adapt to everything else? Are we cutting off or constraining our ability to come up with radically different ideas about how to do things at the very, very moment when we need those radical ideas the most? Radical creativity is like dancing. You do it best when you think nobody is watching. The whole point of radical creativity is that it is truly disruptive. It's disruptive of how we think, act, and feel, and we can't do it if somebody is watching. Thank you.
Well, Marie, we were all watching you and mesmerised, so I hope it didn't interfere with your creativity. I don't think so. The next speaker is David de Roure, who has strategic responsibility with the Oxford... Where's David? Great. We have strategic responsibility with the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities, and member of Cybersecurity Oxford, and an Oxford Martin Senior Fellow. Previously director of Oxford E Research Centre and professor of computer science at the University of Southampton, and involved in lots of really important things.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Maria. That was a fantastic talk to follow, and I think it connects. We'll see. Yes, I think the introduction suggests that I'm a kind of interdisciplinary researcher, and I've come at Internet of Things as a computer scientist, as a social scientist, and actually now as humanities, which I'm not going to talk about so much today. But yesterday I was at the Turing Institute with the 14 Arduinos talking about speculative design fictions around the life of Ada Lovelace and Charles Babbage. Talk to me about that later. One of the great things about this, the brief for this panel, is it said choose the single most significant issue. So that caused me to think about my normal talks about Internet of Things, which I've got about 10 issues, and choose one. And hopefully the other 9 will come up when we have a discussion. So I've chosen this sort of issue around emergent behaviours, by which I mean socio-technical. And I'm pleased that during the various panels today, this notion of sort of emergence has occurred a few times, and also risk, and I will connect these things together. So I'm going to start by going back in time a little way, and this is in order to bring something into the discussion we haven't heard so much about, and that's actually about the skills for all of this. So back in the late 1990s, I spent some time at MIT in a group. Actually, the group was called, if anyone knows the architecture of MIT historically, there was the Laboratory for Computer Science and the AI Lab, and they were 2 very distinct things. They've all come together now. But I was in the group called Switzerland because it was neutral but heavily armed, with Hal Abelson and Jerry Sussman. And we were working on this thing called amorphous computing, and it was kind of a crazy idea at the time because there's no way the hardware would have existed then, but we were anticipating hardware that would exist decades hence. And one of the sort of thought experiments is imagine you could fabricate lots of processors, lots of silicon chips, and tip a bucket load of these things into concrete and build something out of the concrete. How do you program that thing? How do you program that bridge to tell you when a bit's going to fall off or something? So it was, what's the paradigm? And this goes back to the Kuhnian reference earlier, but what's the paradigm for programming these systems where you've got large numbers of unreliable components which are communicating unreliably, which may or may not have power, which if they go down may or may not ever come back again, which you cannot reboot, which you cannot apply a patch to. So that was the world we were anticipating. And I think what was interesting about this, in some ways, is the methods by which we did that. So we built a simulator so that people could practice programming these systems. And that's what I was most closely involved in. And we used it for teaching. And when I came to teach fairly senior MIT undergraduates in computer engineering, this whole notion of amorphous computing, and set them assignments like write the program that will run all these processes so that its behavior evolves into the pattern of a CMOS inverter, a chip, right? That was quite a hard one. The reaction of the students was to, in a good computer science tradition, build layers and layers to make a reliable system which they then knew how to program. And it took a while to unprogram those students and get them to think about, no, this is emergent. We're borrowing ideas from biology. We weren't trying to understand biology, but we looked at how cells work. We looked at how differentiation occurs, and sort of hacked with notions from there. And then I came back to Southampton, and for many years taught this to Southampton second years on a very large-scale distributed systems course. There's like large-scale, small-scale systems. Actually, I found that the students there were really good at getting their heads around this, but it is a different way of thinking. And the simulator was really important because it meant you had some intuitions, you programmed this system, you thought what was going to happen, something completely different happens, and you iterate, and eventually you get the hang of dealing with these emergent systems. And I wanted to mention that story because I'm not sure that we're programming our current rounds of graduates in computer science and other disciplines for that kind of world. Now I'm going to fast forward from the late 90s to the world of social media. There it is. It's interesting, you'll see on some of my slides, I've deliberately taken text from stories about things, stories about social machines, as I shall explain. And the reason is one of our methods for study from a social science viewpoint has been, going back to Maria's talk, exactly that. The social machines, social media in this case, and many of the discussions today are highly observed. There's lots of stories about them, and one analytic method is to look at those stories. It's kind of life writing about machines. It's prosopography for bits of machines and whole machines. This is one that many of you may be familiar with. I don't know how many of you indulged in this in 2014. It's what sort of history relates as the Cancer Research UK No Makeup Selfie campaign, where people were putting up pictures on 3 social machines, Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And this is interesting in many ways. So the first point I want to make is that Twitter is an example of a sort of a highly democratized system where citizens are empowered to create new social processes. So earlier on I was talking about sort of processes in computation or in concrete, bulk computation in concrete. Here I'm talking about social processes. By letting people create any hashtag they want to, entirely new phenomena have occurred at scale around social media, and we see it exhibited in different ways in different systems. This is an interesting one. So first of all, we know that there are 3 different social media systems there. We also note there's some coupling going on. So when you posted a picture, you nominated a friend to do the same. So there's a social dimension to this. And that's interesting because it's an evolving, emergent process. No one really planned this. And actually, Cancer Research UK really didn't plan this. This was the original tweet. It says, we're loving your cancer awareness no make it suffer. The campaign isn't ours, but every pound helps. So this process had already started out. They've jumped on it with this picture, which says, text this donation by texting beat to this number. Retrospectively, they wish they'd got people to sign up to an ongoing recurrent. Anyway, this all happened over a weekend. It's 2 million and 8 million pounds raised over a weekend. So the other interesting thing for me, and it's really relevant to this talk, is that if you mistyped beat and your predictive text, which arguably is another social machine, corrected that to, for example, bear instead, then what you did was adopt a polar bear. Okay. Thank you for choosing an adorable polar bear to reply from we will call you today. So the point about this is that's an accidental emergence. So they've jumped on the original social machine. They've got this fantastic campaign going on. At the same time, other social machines completely accidentally have got involved in this. And that's the whole point. There's intentional emergence of these behaviours, these social processes, and there's also the unintended. And that's my point, as you will see. Now, Wendy has mentioned in her intro this notion of this the sort of social and the digital. So we can have my 4-quadrant slide. Apologies for those who've seen it before. And I offer this to all of you because what you can do with this slide is take the title of your talk and put it in the 4th quadrant. I guarantee it works. Right? So essentially, moving away from the mic, as time goes on, more and more people have been engaged in the digital world, for example, through the web. Also, we have Moore's law on this axis, but we have more and more capability in the processing, in the silicon, more cores, more RAM, more storage. And the really interesting and complex space that we're really discussing now is that top right-hand quadrant, and that's the one I want to drill down on. We've kind of got there. The web has taken us, and web science has taken us along this way and up. And those involved in distributed computation, for example, in scientific research, have sort of gone up through the distributed computation. Do anyone remember the grid, supercomputing and so on, and then coming over to the right there. But we've ended up in this top right-hand corner, and it's a really interesting space because it's where citizens are engaged with the digital world. They're generating data. We've been hearing about it all day. Sometimes they're actually the consumers of that data. Sometimes they're actually involved in the analytics. So the whole world of citizen science involves bringing the crowd together with the scale of data to resolve things. You can have fun putting your favourite projects and things onto this diagram. But what I want to mention today is really what happens next. So, thank you. Oh, really?
Yeah,
gosh. Sorry, thanks. That's okay. What happens next? So you could say we carry on at 45 degrees, but actually at some point you might run out of people and you have to, it would be more about the computers. But I would say automation, increasing with the Internet of Things, lots of machine to machine. AI coming in, that's especially the machine learning piece. Learning from the humans we have got so the computers can process all the additional data that they're working with. And all of these things mean more coupling in the systems. So I'm going to close on that coupling point. So Wendy said there's another dimension, a third dimension, and I've tried drawing that previous one with a third dimension. It's really hard, but I'm going to use this one instead. And my point here is we have the sort of human-digital intersection rehearsed through social media, through this notion of social machines that we've been studying. The cyber-physical intersection is the digital-physical one there. I think we've, in social science, learnt to work in real time, learned to work with all new and emerging forms of data in that social media space, touching onto physical, because much of it is geolocated. That's our rehearsal for Internet of Things. My question is whether we're ready for the data supply that's there. And the other point is the coupling of all these things. So that now, anything happening in one of these spaces connects up with the others, with data sharing, with the machine learning, the processes, the behaviours are coupling as well. And as these systems become increasingly coupled, then we're increasing risk. And there's a whole other talk about risk and what we're doing about that in the Petrus project. So ask me about that in a minute. Thank you very much.
I've got the chatty group. So I'm now relying on Emily Taylor, who's an Associate Fellow at Chatham House, and she's the editor of the Journal of Cyber Policy, which I want to give a big plug for. It's a peer-reviewed journal that we produce with Taylor and Francis Routledge. I'm sure Emily would be delighted to hold one up as she comes up to the podium and get your name. So she's also done lots of amazing things. ICANN, Oxford Information Labs, lots of things in the Caribbean and the Middle East, chairs of everything, who is review team, and so on. Amazing.
Thank you very much. And to complete the plug, this is the journal, and in fact our latest issue, which I'm holding, is devoted to the Internet of Things. So I just thought I'd get that out of the way. Yes, do subscribe. Patricia, I always obey Patricia. I find it best. And she asked in the preparation for the panel to what we consider to be the single most important and significant issue relating to Internet of Things, you know, as it relates to the legal society and so on, and how might it be mitigated. Now, I'm a lawyer, so that's immediately like the question, and I'm going to try and answer it. But it really did cause me a lot of problems preparing, because I had so many things buzzing around my head about what the most important issue was, exactly as you said. You know, is it the future of work and what's going to happen to people in those the middle section of economies, the people who don't have that many skills, who don't have that much cognitive ability, who've always, in an industrialised world, had a good living. What about them? No, I'm not going to talk about that. I'm not going to talk about AI and the increasing agency of machines and what that means for us when they start thinking, making decisions for us and talking to each other in ways that we don't understand. I'm not going to talk about that either. I'm not going to talk very much about the impact on our mental and physical well-being of being so observed. I think that the previous speakers, particularly Maria, touched on this beautifully. I'd like to talk a bit more about privacy. It's been bubbling there, you know, and we ran a series at Chatham House on Internet of Things of seminars, and it would be like, this one's about privacy, and everyone would be talking about security. This one's about security, and everyone sort of ranges into talking about privacy. They're so interconnected. But I wanted to think about, you know, what is going to happen when there's just so much more data. And don't forget, for those of us in the UK, this is metadata. This is communications data in the terminology of the Investigatory Powers Act, and therefore it is less protected. It's subject to less safeguards than what we've come to view as the actual content of the communications. But as Maria said, as David said, it's so revealing what is going to be made up in this three-dimensional portrait of each and every one of us. Somebody I once heard talked about it like being like Pigpen from Peanuts. Do you remember Peanuts, the cartoon? And Pigpen had this sort of aura of smell about him, and that's going to be us walking around living our lives with our aura of data. Al Gore, who's credited by some people as having invented the internet, he didn't. In 2014, he said, "We live in a stalker economy. Business is collecting way more information than it should. And every time we collectively have had the choice between convenience and privacy or security, we've chosen convenience." Now, we've also become conditioned to not just the CCTVs, and maybe we feel safer because of that surveillance, who knows? But we've also come to tolerate an incredibly exploitative deal in return for these free services. One of my areas of study has been the terms and conditions of the online providers. And according to one study, it would take the average person 250 hours a year to read all of the terms and conditions and privacy policies of all the services that they use. So obviously, no one does that. I mean, how many of you routinely read the terms and conditions before clicking I agree? I think there should be some sort of prize for you. The single person in the room, well, so am I. So am I, and I don't, because what's the point? You're just going to upset yourself. There's nothing you can do. It's a bit like Boris Johnson's term, I'm pro-cake and pro-eating it. What we see is that there is a very one-sided deal where you provide all of your data for every purpose you can imagine and lots that you can't imagine. And in return, you get the provider completely excluding all liability for everything, including that it will be fit for purpose or of any of the sort of standard consumer things. And that's it, really. It's what Bruce Schneier called a shockingly extensive, robust and profitable surveillance architecture. Leaked documents claim that Facebook is now able to identify teenagers' emotional states as they happen, including anxious, insecure, worthless, because behavioural psychology tells us, when combined with marketing, that people are most likely to buy or make a decision to do something at the point where they feel vulnerable or disorientated. It's quite powerful stuff. So I don't think it's all the consumer's fault for opting for convenience, because I think Al Gore should also recognise that some of the blame for our current situation must lie at the door of governments. The sort of laissez-faire, light touch or no touch regulation certainly led to a burgeoning in the development and deployment of these exciting technologies. And don't get me wrong, I love using them and I'm a total addict of them. But at the same time, it has given rise to incredibly powerful empires, and it's difficult. I do agree with Maria. I think it's difficult to see how they are going to be supplanted, given that they're sitting on so much powerful data. So, what's all this got to do with the Internet of Things? Well, I think it's going to be more of the same, but much more in a way that we can't possibly comprehend. And, the thing that I worry about is the lifespan of that data. And one of the perverse consequences, we're now seeing over the summer, people have obviously taken the quiet period in Silicon Valley to update their terms and conditions to reflect the General Data Protection Regulation. So they're now all pretty much moving towards their position on compliance. And there's been much made of this, the right to be forgotten, which is the right that we all as individuals have to go to these companies and ask for our data to be deleted. The perverse consequence of that is that they're now being a lot more open about how long they keep the data, forever, unless you as an individual trigger that right. And so I think that that's probably not quite what the legislators had in mind. I think that we need to think a bit more differently, going to mitigation, about the lifespan of this data. In normal life, we have a conversation, it's gone. We walk down the street. If we're not holding a phone and we're out of range of CCTV, we're unobserved. We have to try to create an environment. And the companies that have this ability to even detect a teenager's emotional state can certainly differentiate one type of data from another and just kill it off after a bit. What's the point of hoarding it like some OCD attic person in case it comes in handy? So the data lifespan ought to be shorter. And you know, maybe there ought to be some sort of new deal. And I would really like to see a few consumer groups actually challenging the legality of these terms and conditions, not just on the GDPR grounds, but on good old-fashioned Unfair Contract Terms Act or even human rights grounds. I think we could get some pretty exciting and pretty radical results that might well change behaviours. That's the hope. But I'm going to leave it there. And I hope that we can perhaps address some of the other issues that could well have made the top spot in the most significant list. Thank you.
Oh God, we're having all the fun stuff in ours. I'm feeling quite desperate now about how absurd. Actually, you know, if you grow up believing in God, this feels very normal. Next up is Laura DeNardis, who is Professor of Internet Architecture and Governance and Faculty Director of the Internet Governance Lab at American University in Washington, D.C. Background in information engineering, doctorate in science and technology studies. She's written books on the global war for internet governance, protocol politics, the globalization of internet governance, and others. She served as the Director of Research on the Global Commission on Internet Governance. A number of us were involved with that, and it's great to see you here again, Laura. Thanks so much for coming across the Atlantic.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. And it's good to be out of Washington. I live and work in Washington, and sometimes it's nice to get out. Thank you for that. Everyone has had a Kuhnian, most people have had a Kuhnian reference, so I think my presentation is about what kind of paradigm shift do we need for internet governance. I want to ask the question of how must we rethink internet freedom and internet governance in light of the IoT. Now, the conceptual framework, starting point for that question, and really all of my research, is that arrangements of technical architecture are also arrangements of power. Internet governance is not fixed any more than technology is fixed. I learned this in some interesting ways. Just two really brief stories. When I was a lowly graduate student in engineering, in 1988, the internet went down, and we were all very upset because we used it for internet relay chat and for a number of things. And it was the first takedown of the internet. It was the Morris worm, and it got traced back to a computer at my university. It got traced back to my building. It got traced back to my floor, and it got traced back to a fellow graduate student, Robert Morris, who's now a professor at MIT. And I realized the importance of internet security. That led to a lot of things. One, the feds came around. Two, the media paid attention. Three, it led to the formation of the Computer Emergency Response Team. Very formative. Another formative issue for me was when I did consulting work, secret, clearance, security clearance work for the Department of Defense in the United States, and I realized how the design of architecture is also very political and makes decisions about privacy and security and many aspects of just being human. So now, as an engineer and an internet governance scholar, what I study is the embedded politics in the things you can't see, like routing and addressing and protocols and these technologies that keep the internet operational and the enactment of substantive policy around those technologies. The book that I'm working on right now has a specific bent to it. It's about cyber-physical systems, and the primary theme in this book is that the internet is no longer a communication system. It's a control system in which more things than people are connected and in which infrastructure is even more than ever a proxy for political power. Cyberspace is not merely a discursive public sphere connecting people and content. It's the pervasive background infrastructure, as has been discussed here today, connecting cars. We've seen wearable devices today, home appliances, drones. I would add currency to that, and really every conceivable industry sector. The body is part of this digital object space via wearable technologies, medical monitoring devices, cardiac appliances. So as the internet becomes embedded in these objects all around us, it creates enormous opportunities, but also enormous human rights concerns, because an outage is no longer about losing access to an email or to Wikipedia. It's about losing basic day-to-day functioning in the real world. This shift from the virtual realm to the real world raises the stakes of global internet governance. It's already been mentioned today, the very large DDoS attack when 80 websites that are very popular went down. This definitely affected me on the East Coast of the United States. I remember this day well. Amazon, Reddit, Twitter became inaccessible because of this massive DDoS attack. It did receive a lot of media attention because of the high-profile nature of the sites, but there were many more alarming characteristics to me. First, recall that the attack did not go after these sites. They went after the domain name system, which took down the sites. So this is part of the phenomenon of infrastructures of internet governance serving as this proxy for economic and political power. And it was, of course, massive, but much more consequentially to this conference today, it was carried out by Internet of Things devices, like digital video recorders and security cameras that were easy to infect because of weak default passwords or no passwords or security vulnerabilities. So I wanted to raise this initially because it's important to remember that the IoT is not just a potential target, but it is also a potential attack vector. We're talking a lot about democracy today. I was really happy that people were discussing some of the fake news issues. Well, when infrastructure, not just the content, can be exploited around democratic systems, how will that change democracy? So rather than taking down some kind of content, you take down the infrastructures that get people out to vote. This is a major change. Now, there are a lot of emerging terrains of, there's a missing slide here, but that's okay. Okay, I'll just go there. This speaks to the emerging terrains of internet governance that arise. Because the materiality of these systems has such an obvious physical presence, it really can seem like a local policy issue. But the IoT is not local. It's not even a domestic policy issue. It's a global governance concern. The underlying technologies cross borders in many ways. They're border agnostic, and the physical world interface of cyber-physical systems is really expanding a number of concerns. Just to mention a few that haven't been discussed today. One is this enormous scale requiring bandwidth, spectrum, and IP addresses. So this group may be the only group in the world that appreciates that I wrote my doctoral dissertation on IPv6. Many people here actually know what that is. But this issue of contention over critical internet resources is a major one as the IoT expands the scale. Now, there are also global competition tensions. The IoT is thought to reflect the next wave of cyber innovation, but design values like permissionless innovation and interoperability and open standards are not yet the norm in the IoT. So in many ways, we have a resurgence of proprietary market approaches. I would add that human security and safety are now internet governance issues because attacks can cause a disruption of medical services rather than just communication outages. I would say the most serious potential human security concerns relate to things like attacking critical internet infrastructures. There have been examples of this, and it's not just Stuxnet. I have a researcher now who's from the Ukraine, and energy systems get disrupted in the Ukraine because of cyber attacks. And of course, Emily already talked about privacy as a very significant issue. So there has to be a reconceptualization of internet policy. around this enmeshment of the internet into the material world, and in light of the geopolitical context in which infrastructure is increasingly politicized. So I want to make the most obvious point in the world. All firms are now tech companies. So cyber policy has to address all firms. Banks, Target, Home Depot, McDonald's, there's data gathering everywhere we go. The Barbie, the Hello Barbie. So when we look at tech policy, it has to look at all firms. Another obvious statement, but one that has to be accentuated more in global internet governance, is, and it's a major theme in my book that I'm working on right now, is that cybersecurity is the great human rights issue of our time. Because all of our economic and social systems, and increasingly our medical systems, rely upon a safe and secure digital infrastructure. So there really has to be a reconceptualization around this. So as a final provocation, how do we have to change norms in internet governance? One of the mantras, really something that's almost fetishized in my community, is that we need to have a universal internet and we don't want to have a fragmented internet. Well, I would suggest that maybe in the Internet of Things, it may not be a bad idea to have some fragmentation as a way to have increased security. We also have this idea of multi-stakeholder governance where you always want different people in the room. And we have to think about how to apply that to this environment. We also have a mantra about immunity from liability for information intermediaries. We can't do that anymore. There has to be liability, accountability around these intermediaries that involve not only content and communications, but involve human safety. So we need to rethink this. Consent is very complicated in all of these environments when you don't even have a screen. There are many issues that are arising, and I would suggest that we have to rethink the frameworks for internet governance and think about the internet not only as the communication network, but as the control network that is increasingly responsible for the digital economy as well as our social and economic lives on a day-to-day basis. So thank you very much for the time, and I look forward to the questions.
Great. Well, thanks. I found that really, a lot of it very provocative. A lot of it very thought-provoking. And I suppose the thing that we're finding very difficult is we've created this because, and we're loving it because of the benefits it provides, but we don't know quite how to get rid of the downsides, except to jump out of it entirely, it sounds. So with that, I'm going to throw open the floor for questions. Please, if you could wait for the microphone, introduce yourself, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Dr. Leonard Anderson, company's Comuri. I work in the social care space, and we've got monitoring in the kitchen of older people living alone. So it's surveillance. Now, what we've discovered in research is that 50% of the people that we're trying to help to live independently refuse to be monitored. They don't want to be monitored at all. So what rights does the citizen have to reject things? What rights have they got to refuse to be appearing on CCTV? And there's another sort of corollary question. If I'm selling through retail outlets and something fails, where's the liability? Is it me as a manufacturer? Is it the retailer? Right? So just around the commercials about getting Internet of Things out into the big wide world.
Great. I'm going to take another question before going to the panel. There's someone right at the back. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you to the panelists for some very interesting talks. My name is Roure. I work for the National Centre for Cybersecurity. My question is, how is it going to be possible to get, when there are big choices to be made and possibly big changes to be made in the way that we live our lives, how are we going to get an informed and sensible debate and decision from the citizens who are going to live with the consequences?
Let's start with the Home Secretary.
Right, okay, well, Maria, do you want to start with the Home Secretary?
I will. How to get an informed debate. It's really tough because there are, right now in the UK, the Overton window of what is acceptable and what sorts of issues are susceptible to public debate is ever narrower and ever less sensible. My broad pitch, and in response to the first question as well, is perhaps something I mightn't have expected to see myself saying a few years ago, but I want to see the return of the state. States are susceptible to human rights legislation. States have requirements to be transparent. States have obligations to us. So I want to see less of a hollowing out of all of the public services like social care and the tax base that they rely on, and I want to see us able to do the things that we're supposed to do. So why are we saying we need to surveil people in their homes using technology? It's because local authorities are being told to do more with less, right? It's also because collectively we are far more interested in investing in technology rather than investing in people. We almost we just have this adolescent crush on let's do technology, let's make technology fix that problem. There's an issue about what are people required to give up to be in a surveillance society, and I think the DeepMind issue in the London Hospital Clinical Trust last year, which was brought out by investigative reporting by the New Scientist, and some of the people commentating on that, some of the medical experts said, because you are a patient in a public health system, you are required, you have no basic, real, meaningful consent to not have your data shared with a large multinational company. The same company that is refusing to pay its taxes and is responsible for the hollowing out of care. It's a bit of an aside, but the rationale that was used to use without consent or knowledge all of the data of all of those patients was we need to treat acute kidney injury. Now, acute kidney injury is something that sounds quite technical, but I'll tell you it's very, very simple. It's what happens when you don't have a nurse, you're in hospital, and you don't have a nurse or a healthcare assistant who is going to give you water when you need water and help you go to the toilet when you need to go to the toilet. This is really low-tech stuff, but we will not invest in it. Why?
Laura, how's the state working in the United States at the moment, and do you see the return of the state as being a welcome thing? How's the debate there?
Let me frame this by saying that some people reference Foucault and the panopticon in the form of social control, which is basically this idea of a central tower in a prison that involved prisoners never really knowing if they're watched, but it's the possibility, as I understand it, of being watched that changes the behavior. But we actually live in a society that is not like that. We live in a society in which people are watched all the time and they don't know that they're watched. So I think that having more education and disclosure and requirements for transparency and disclosure among the companies is very vital for this. Regarding the state question, my position has always been, and it remains, that governments in my area of internet governance unfortunately don't have a good track record. And if you think about the extensive, expansive surveillance that it's enacted in the West, including the US and the UK, if you look at the censorship that happens in China, in Iran, if you look at the repression of ICTs in Cuba, the state is not that helpful when it comes to the internet. That's just a fact. That's a fact of internet history. And that doesn't mean that we can't have regulatory structures around this issue. It's just that in many cases, governments have an incentive not to have greater privacy. One more point on this, if I may. Someone who invented a major encryption technology said to me, they never imagined in the 1970s that not everything would be encrypted. It's really kind of crazy that not more is encrypted. Maybe in the IoT space, because it's not necessarily about communications between people, maybe there's an opportunity there to have encryption everywhere and have stronger encryption, because some of the rationales on the part of the state to not have it don't exist in the same way as in the internet as a communication system.
Right. Emily, do you want to add into that?
Yes, just to the example of old people and refusing consent, the ability to refuse consent. I think part of the thrust behind the new laws that are coming in is that is to place much more power in the hands of individuals to refuse consent, and much more onus on organisations to give them a meaningful alternative. At the moment, the alternative is have the service with the surveillance or don't have the service. And in many cases, that's not really possible. And one of the perhaps unexpected outcomes of the legislation is that consent has now become such a complex thing. We've heard other speakers talking about it, the endless interrupts and all of the things that will go with it, that even the British Information Commissioner's Office is advising companies, if they want to be compliant, to look at other ways of being compliant rather than consent, such as necessity. And that goes, if you're in social care and you want to live alone, it's necessary for us to observe you. I don't know whether that's a sustainable position. How do we get an informed debate? I think we live with the stuff a bit more and we find out what the impact is. Many of the advocates for bulk retention of data and mass surveillance say, well, when you come to me with examples of harm, actual harm, rather than speculation about harm, then we'll talk. So we don't seem to mind that much. We've had CCTV for ages. We don't seem to mind that much. We're not abandoning the social networks because they surveil us, even though we know that they share data with government and government has the same objective to collect all the data. We don't seem to mind. And so I don't know how we get an informed debate, and I certainly think that one of the things that's polarising debate at the moment is the sort of algorithmic herding of people around like-mindedness. So you have this worldview, and if you have it, then all you will see on your social network feeds are people who agree with you. And you think that, well, that's how it is then. And I don't think, and what we know is that when people are exposed to people who agree with them, they become emboldened in their point of view and less tolerant of people who disagree. And I think now more than ever we need a bit more tolerance and a bit more striving to cross that divide between these very strongly held points of view.
David?
Briefly, I just want to turn that question around. We've mentioned the Petra's project a few times today. The E of Petra stands for ethics. So not from the point of view of the consumer who's being observed and may wish to opt out, but from the point of view of the researcher, the engineer, the developer who's been creating and producing devices for use by people. What are the obligations on me ethically in doing that? And I think Internet of Things raises a couple of really tricky things. So there's an emerging notion of responsible innovation. When we apply for research funding now from EPSRC, we have to write a paragraph where we think not about the ethics process, but the ethics of our product and the purpose of what we're doing. It's very hard in Internet of Things when you're building pieces that are going to get assembled by people creatively to do all sorts of things that you can't anticipate. The other thing is the ethical algorithms piece, which is a long discussion that we haven't got time to talk about today. But those citizens might opt out of that particular piece of surveillance, but they're being captured in many other ways. That data is being used algorithmically behind the scenes. What are the obligations on the people who are working with those algorithms? So there's some big questions from the ethics side. Oh, and the answer to the sensible debate is here we are today. Thank you very much.
Well, I mean, here's a question. Is there a different debate taking place between the young people compared with older people? Is there a different debate taking part in different communities, in different cities, in different countries? And is this a single debate, or actually are there very different views going on within smaller communities? Could I have the young woman at the back, please? Thanks. And another at the back as well. So there's two. Oh, yes, sorry. Come to you again. No, at the back. Thanks.
Micah Rental, Technopolis Group. That actually you just sort of posed the question I had in my mind. I'm married to someone from Silicon Valley who lives on Facebook with his colleagues, everybody he knows. And I'm from Germany originally, and we have exchange students who are young, 15, 14, who don't have Facebook profiles because they were taught by their parents, be very careful about what you do on the internet, don't have a Facebook profile. I mean, I suspect they're on Snapchat or other things, so it's kind of the same. But they're much more sensitized to the lurking dangers out there. They can't quite voice what that would be, but they're very careful about it. Now, the funny thing is then we have visitors from the US, and they kind of laugh at those silly Germans who why are you scared? I mean, it's the same thing around medicines where, Germans like to use their herbs and maybe suffer a bit longer, but that's just what they believe in, rather than over-medicating with ibuprofen, which is what my American friends do immediately. There's somewhere in the middle is the right answer, probably. But I was interested in just that question. Are there cultures, or are there studies, I'm sure they are, around different approaches to your profile, your life on the internet and in the public? And is that in some ways reflected in the national laws or the policy debate that's going on in those countries?
Well, there are even different concepts of privacy in different cultures. At the back, please. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. So the question
Could you speak up a bit, please?
Yeah, sorry, the question is basically about the use of amorphous computing. And, to take the example of having the sensors in the concrete, what happens if these IoT devices last longer than their designed lifespan? Everyone's talking about, well, what if they fail early? Well, what if they don't? What if they continue working, 50, 60, 100 years? We're surrounded by architecture that's over 100 years old. Is this going to happen in the future where you're going to have a smart building but talking using sensors that was in a programming language that was designed 100 years ago?
And then over here, please. Thank you. It's great that we still have to use physical microphones.
Steve Vallis, I'm a technologist. I'm interested in how the panel feels around the wider use of technology and the culpability and liability, and the fact that government and people seem to be holding technology to a higher standard than the equivalent human. Taking sort of robotics and robotic use of medicine, doctors kill people. But if a robot kills someone, it's the end of the world. And it does seem a higher standard around autonomous vehicles than we expect from the humans that either created them or are doing the same. So.
Right, who wants to hit those three questions?
Wow. Do the amorphous.
Do you want to do the amorphous? Yeah. Do you want to be amorphous?
I can do, well, I can't really, but I can have a go at the concepts of privacy.
Okay, let's go to David first on the...
Thanks for picking that up about amorphous computing, because that's exactly the point, I think, with Internet of Things. We shouldn't make the assumption that you put some devices out there, they're all the same, they behave the way you intended, and they do their job and they're done. You have to think about the whole life cycle. They can be out there for a very long time. If you're in environmental sensor networks, these things are deployed once. You drop your sensor down the bottom of a hole into a glacier, you're never going to see that again. It is that world of an ecosystem of devices out there, and anything you do is the intervention into that, and you have to understand that. So I have a kind of example of exactly the situation you suggested. And others in the room who are interested in building management systems will sort of recognise this, Jeremy. But recently in Oxford, we've had to close down a building entirely and shift a lot of researchers because it was just to do with the amount of asbestos in the building. It's called the Tinbergen building. It's been a big thing. But it made me think of the sort of the IoT equivalent of that. One day you could be in a building and devices that had been in there from the time it was built, a very long time ago, started... those devices that were made by a manufacturer, maybe in another country, start interacting in ways you didn't anticipate with the new devices that are going into them. What can you do about it? So it's kind of IoT asbestos. Do you have to evacuate the building, build another one, because this building is now out of bounds because it's got those devices by that supplier? So I think that's a great example. Thank you.
Emily?
Noam Chomsky was talking about the attitudes of young people, and he said something like, companies are conspiring with young people to parade their private lives in public. And I'm not sure if I agree. I think that, individuals have different tolerances, and I can't point to any academic research on this, and I'd be really interested if anyone knows of any. But from my limited experience of observation of people who are younger than me on these networks, is that they've been very adaptive in their behaviour. They've probably encountered cyberbullying, They've probably encountered the embarrassment of revealing something that they later regret. And I find that they probably use messaging a lot more than they do updating. Older people are dreadful show-offs and want to impress their neighbours and depress their friends by publishing pictures of how happy and successful they are. But the young people that I know tend to post less and message more. But I think what they're unaware of is all of those seemingly private conversations are just as heavily monitored and just as heavily plundered for the data in my view, quite an exploitative way. I think your point about holding machines to a higher standard is absolutely well taken. And one of the things that really fascinates me about this area is that quite often the new technology will throw up age-old things that have never been sorted out, and we feel really, really upset and worried that we haven't been able to solve them. But I think a lot of it is about anxiety and control. Some people really fear going on a plane because somebody else is driving it, and they just can't imagine why you can stay up in midair. And again, people have different tolerances, but I do think, and to sort of turn it a little bit, we expect perfection and to be able to have all the data online. Whereas offline, if we were in law enforcement or in a company, we would absolutely be fine with the fact that we don't know everything about everybody and we have to guess sometimes. And I hope we can inject some of that reality back into the thinking.
Laura.
Fortunately, there's always a generational shift in the kinds of platforms that are popular. I've never been on Facebook myself, but I know a lot of people on Facebook. But there's always a generational shift, and when you say to someone, well, when Facebook is supplanted by something else, they say, what? But all my data is on Facebook. It will never be toppled. And people said the same exact thing about America Online in the 1990s. They said the same thing about Friendster. They said the same thing about MySpace. And part of it is because kids don't want to be on a social media platform with their parents. Right? So there'll be some turnover, which I think is good. Now, granted, there's a tremendous conservative momentum in Facebook just because of the extent and the number of users. But education does make a big difference. And there was a study, and several studies actually, one by Dana Boyd in the United States, that looked at privacy conceptions among different generations, and it found that young people, I hope I'm not misstating this, but you could look it up online, just that young people are more aware of privacy because of all of the education, and this is particularly in the US. So education really does make a difference. Now, that doesn't solve the problem of them not knowing the kind of data that's collected, even in something like Snapchat, which is supposed to be very private, but they gather data also. So there are things you still can't see, but the education can make a difference. And there was another excellent point about the different values. There are different conceptions of privacy. There are different emphases on free speech, for example, in the US versus privacy in the EU. In some places, it's culturally unacceptable and legally unacceptable to insult a monarch, and you can go to jail for that. So there are very, very malleable values around all of this, and I expect that there will be in the Internet of Things as well. It's a matter of giving the end user the choice to make decisions based on their own culture and their own environment.
Maria, do you have anything to add?
I suppose the only thing I would add is that there are some studies that show, even in the United States, US Pen, which is an organization that is for American writers, they surveyed their members a couple of years ago, and they found out that following the Snowden revelations about state surveillance, American journalists and writers across the board, from poets to journalists, were censoring themselves, were had cut down on the number of people that they were talking to, had narrowed the types of stories they were writing, were absolutely extremely allergic to anything to do with the Middle East, terrorism, did not want to talk to their sources, did not want to meet their sources, did not even want to Google the topics that they were writing on. And there was, really, really strong both qualitative and quantitative research to show that people will self-censor. And that is in arguably one of the freest countries in the world.
Well, I think we've reached the end of this panel. I think it's been a fascinating discussion. What I've really liked about it as well is that we focused on the Internet of Things, we looked at all the censorship, and we've come back in the end to the Internet and social media, as I suspected we would. In that, these things are all very connected. But I do think what I'm hearing is we need a lot more research, basic research on the concepts of privacy, the way people behave, but then also what we seem to need more research than anything else is what we do about this and how we factor this in. So, how much, for example, will new types of encryption, how much will that help? What about when we move into hybrid and quantum computing? Will that have an impact on all of this? So this is a fast-changing technical environment as well as a fast-changing social environment, and that interactivity and that adaptability that you've mentioned, which I think is generational, but I think there's also cultural. I think we're seeing very different behaviours, for example, in China or in India, as in, you mentioned Germany, but other parts of Europe and North America and Africa as well. So with that, I want to thank our panellists very much for a really stimulating, thought-provoking session. So thank you.